Back again. I'm going to try a third chapter in one day. It's going to be a long one, too. 38 pages on my Kindle. Could be close to an hour and a half reading total. Don't know how many parts I'm going to have to divide it into and how many parts I might lose. Still working with photo booth. Although I may, who knows, when I may give up on it if it keeps shafting me. Not that objectively I haven't gotten some benefit out of having to redo things. And also it helps me, it's a little bit of gratitude practice, I guess, when I click the stop button and realize I didn't get a corrupted file and I didn't lose the last 8 minutes of recording. Alright, but to it now. Chapter 9, Eskimo Spring. As I became more competent with the language, I discovered that the talk of the people was largely devoted to times past. It almost seemed as if the Ihalmuit were making a deliberate effort to relive those dead days, as if they wished me to see them, not as they are, but as they had once been. Slowly and carefully, they used words to rebuild the old shattered pattern of life as it had been lived in the Barrens, so I might also live with them in those happier times. And it was not long before their efforts began to have a desired effect, and I could see in my mind's eye something of the richness and vigor of the life the people had led in those vanished years, when a man might stand on a hill, and though he looked to the east, to the west, to the north, or to the south, he would not know where the land was, for all he could see was Tuktu, the deer. All he could hear was the sound of their feet. All he could smell was the sweet scent of their odor. Little connections popping into my mind with the death of Ivan Ilyich. One of the things that happened to him as he realized he was dying, in a very real way. I think like the Ihalmuit are realizing here that they're dying. He found himself drawn most powerfully back to the beautiful memories of his childhood, and I think there's a very real similarity there to the Ihalmuit really thinking about the more youthful days of their tribe and their culture, back when things were happier. In the days that are gone, the deer came out of the forest in spring, and the does' bellies hung heavy with fawn, and the strident demands of new life rang through the land. Then the people would come from the tents which stood by the abandoned igloos of winter, and old men and old women stood by and smiled a toothless welcome to Tuktu. The hunters came from the tents and saw to it that the kayaks were ready. If the kayak coverings were torn, then the women hurriedly soaked hides in the melting stream and stretched the new skin over the slim ribs of the hunting craft. When the deer began to cross the thawing rivers that ran near the camps, the men went out to hunt. They carried their deer spears, and they pushed their kayaks into the ice-filled waters of rivers and lakes. The women walked down the shores to the places where converging rows of stone pillars had been built many generations before to funnel the migrating herds to where the hunters waited. These fences were put right by the women, for the winter gales might have toppled the stones and torn off the headpieces of moss, which helped make the pillars look like men to the deer. As soon as these deer fences were ready, the women and the young children would go out into the plains, which were still covered with yielding spring snow. There they lay hidden in depressions amongst the rocks or in the moss until a deer herd came by. As the deer passed, the watchers shouted and jumped to their feet and closed in behind the fear-stricken beasts, driving them into the embrace of the stone fences. The deer ran down between the narrowing arms of the fences until they came to the bank of the river and to the place appointed to the hunters. As the fleeing animals entered the water, the kayaks were unleashed against them, and the spring killing began. Spears flashed in the sun, and dead deer floated down with the current into the bays below. So strange to think of a people being able to have tremendous love for a species and also to slaughter it in such numbers, members of it in such numbers. And I remembered what I was going to say at the beginning of the chapter. find myself thinking about really wanting to be on top of my game, being very sharp when I read this, so the performance is best. And so I find myself feeling a little bit more empathetic to the stories that I've heard about really flighty, temperamental actors in film who need to be coddled and spend time in their trailers until the moment when they need to be called on camera. If they care about their art, they probably also have a real awareness of the sensitivity involved if you're going to operate at an incredibly high level like that. Strikes me as maybe very different how athletes work, because they're working at a high level of polish as well, but athleticism and sports is very, the combat and the violence in it is a different kind of performance than in art and acting. The spring was a time of great killing, and yet the people took only enough in those days to meet their needs until fall. For the hides of the spring deer are useless for clothing, and the meat is lean and lacking in fat. There was much gorging on fresh meat in the spring, for when the sun again stands high in the sky, the bellies of men revolt from the dry meat and the frozen meat that is their diet all winter. Down in the backwaters of the bays on the river, the old men pulled the floating bodies ashore, and the women came in with their sharp, curved knives and flensed the deer where they lay. Then, bent double under the weight of fresh meat and of great bundles of marrow bones, they went back to the camps. But not all of the carcasses of the deer were butchered and skinned. A great many were only gutted and anchored with rocks, deep under the fast, cold flow of the waters, where the meat would stay fresh well into the last days of summer. After the herds had passed by to the north, the people moved their camps up to the slopes of the hills, so that the long winds could battle the flies which were coming. Here the people lived till midsummer, awaiting the return of the deer. Summer was the time of eggs and young birds. Even the children went daily out over the plains with their toy slings and bows to search for the eggs and the young of the ptarmigan, of the curlew, of the ducks, and even of the tiny songbirds of the Barrens. The men, too, did not let their hunting skills grow rusty, for they searched out the dens of the great Arctic wolves and took enough pelts for mats and for the trimmings of the parkas. But during most of the summer the men worked at building new kayaks, repairing their sleds, and preparing for the return of the herds. In the evenings they went to the hilltops and stared into the flaming sky of the north, waiting and watching for the sight of the deer. By midsummer, the first herds of does were again passing down into the land of the people, and for a month the hunting was done out on the plains. At this time of the year, and until the deer had again swung to the north, the skins were still of little value, except for those of the fawns, and there was no need for a large kill. So the hunters went out with the bows made of the springy horn of the muskox, and they stalked the deer over the hills and killed only a few, picking the fattest beasts with great care. At last, in late summer, the herds again swung to the north and passed out of the Ihalmuit land. This was the time of the greatest activity during the year, for it was known that when the deer came back again it would be only for the brief few days, as they fled south before the approach of winter, and after that the herds would not be seen again in the land until spring. It was known that when the deer came for this last time to the little hills, they would not linger, but would come like a flood and pass quickly. All things had to be ready to greet their arrival, for the lives of the people depended on the success of the fall hunt. The last rotten ice was all gone from the rivers and from most of the lakes before fall, and so the deer followed new routes, swinging along the curved shores of the great lakes and crossing the rivers just below or above open bodies of water. In the land of the Ihalmuit there were many such crossing places, all of ageless antiquity, where the deer were funneled by the lakes and the hills into narrow defiles. To those places the people now moved their tents, setting up hunting camps a few miles away from each crossing, so the presence of the tents would not interfere with the movements of the deer. In the old days, the Ihalmuit told me about, there would be 30 or 40 tents, near each of the 7 most famous crossings. And there would be many scores of tents, at other minor crossing places scattered over the land. In these camps the men worked lovingly on their kayaks and sharpened the copper points of their spears till they were as keen as fine razors. The women roamed the land all about, heaping up piles of willow twigs against the days when they would build the biggest fires of all the year to render down the sweet deer fat. The youths paddled for 2 or 3 days to the north and camped on the hilltops, from which they could see the approach of the deer and carry the warning back to the camps. The men who were too old to hunt watched for signs. They watched for a sudden upswing in the numbers of foxes and wolves, and for the forming of great flocks of scavenger gulls that accompany the herds. But most of all, they watched for flights of ravens coming out of the north. For these are the sure heralds of the approach of the deer. Excitement and tension built up in the camps as the fall days slowly passed. There were alarms occasioned by small wandering herds that happened in the land ahead of the migration, and as always, some of the people wondered if this time, by some terrible malice of fate, the deer might fail to move south by the particular crossings where the skin tent stood waiting. There was no sleep and little rest. At night the drums sounded, and the voices of the hunters sang the songs of the killing of Tuktu, where the people told tales of the deer they had seen and killed in their time, until the late dawn crept into the sky. Then on a day in October there would be snow in the air. A kayak would sweep up the river out of the north, and the man in it held his spear aloft as a signal. "They come!" was the cry in the camps, and the hunters ran to their places, and the women and children ran to the tops of the ridges north of the crossing. This was the time of the greatest slaughter. Swimming the rivers, the deer met the repeated onslaught of the kayaks. At the valleys and gullies the deer met the hunters. Blood flowed at the crossings, and the hunt went on far into each night. In the camps, huge fires burned all day and all night, and blocks of white deer fat began to mount up in the tents. On the bushes, which spread their dead leaves in the hollows, thin slices of meat were laid out to dry, until the valleys and hills about the camps by the crossings glowed a dull red under the waning sun. All over the land, but most thickly about the deer crossings, little cairns of rocks sprang up like blisters on the grey face of the plains. Under these cairns were the quartered bodies of the deer. On the sandy shores, by the tents, many thousands of fine hides lay staked out with their naked sides upward, and women and children worked over these hides, cleaning and scraping them thin. I realized it's still the middle of the night, but I have a light on the far side of my computer that's off, whereas in the previous chapter it was on. So I'm aware that the lighting on my face and my body is slightly different. I don't imagine it's enough to be jarring to anybody watching the video, but it's something nominally worth noting. I try hard not to interrupt the reading unless it's something relevant or insightful, and not distracting and self-indulgent. I hope I'm succeeding at that. The excitement mounted to a frenzy of action until, in less than a week from the day the man in the kayak had first signaled the approach of the deer, the great herds were gone. The crossings were empty of living deer, and only the dead remained there. The snows came, and all things, save man and the ravens, turned as white as the snow. The ptarmigan found their white feathers, the fox turned white, and the weasel. The snowy owls drifted out of the more distant north, and they too were white as the great Arctic wolves. Then it was winter, and the great herds were gone, but there still remained game to hunt out on the bleak winter plains. In the valleys protected by the hills, so that the snow did not drift thickly over their floors, and in the high places where the wind kept the land scoured free of snow, and the lichens were not too deeply buried, there were still a few deer who had been caught and cut off by the advent of winter. If it happened that by accident or bad luck a family of the people became short of meat in the winter, then food could still be procured by a good hunter. It was harder to hunt Tuktu in winter, for then the deer were in small groups, widely spaced, and they were wary. Only when the ground drift was thick or during a blizzard could they be approached by the hunters. But if the deer were hard to hunt, they could be easily trapped. When a hunter set out, not from need but from a desire to eat of freshly killed meat, he might choose to dig a pit in the side of a drift. The pit had high walls, sometimes built up with snow, and there was a ramp up one side, also built of hard snow blocks. On the top of a thin layer of brush covered with snow concealed the trap, and for bait there was a handful of moss, or better yet, a piece of frozen urine of a man or of a dog. It is a strange fact that the deer smell urine from a great distance in winter, and because it is salty they will abandon all caution to reach it. Even the wolf knows this, and often a wolf will lie hidden near a snow hummock where he has urinated, so that if there are deer near at hand they will come to the bait. Sometimes, if the snow was not deep enough for a pit, the hunter dug a sloping trench only as wide as a deer into a snowbank. At its end he would place the bait, and when a deer descended the sloping incline, it would neither back out nor turn around, and so it was caught. That mention of wolf urine makes me think of one attempt to keep deer, real deer, not caribou, away from a garden I had in St. Johnsbury about 15 years ago. And wolf urine was something I purchased from the local hardware store once and sprayed around the garden in an attempt to keep the deer away. Of course, this was the middle of summer, and it wasn't caribou. Turned out not to work terribly well if the deer were really hungry. In the end, it was fences with fishing line that confused the deer enough, despite the weakness of it. The fact that it was invisible distracted them and confused them enough to keep them away. Different kind of food related issue. Civilized gardens as opposed to caribou in the wild Arctic. Sometimes, if the snow was not deep enough for a pit, the hunter dug a sloping trench only as wide as a deer into a snowbank. At its end he would place the bait, and when the deer descended in the sloping incline it could neither back out nor turn around, and so was caught. Sorry, I read that a second time, but I'll leave it in. Briefly, that was the way of things in the old days the Ihalmuit remembered so well and talked of so freely. But the way of things now is so bitter that it is hard for me to persuade the people to speak of the present. For a while I knew no more about it than I could see for myself or had picked up from Franz. Then, little by little, I began to gather odd fragments of tales from the time that is now, and at last I was able to reconstruct the present pattern of life as it is shown by the happenings which took place under the little hills in the spring of 1947. I have already written of what came to pass by Utek in that fateful spring when Franz found the two orphans, Kuni and Anotelik. I also mentioned 3 other families who had fled eastward in search of help. Now I would take up their story and complete it. So you will see the new way of life in the plains as I came to see it, and so you will understand why the Ihalmuit dwell so much on the days when the deer were many, and life was good to the people. The story was told to me, mainly by Ohoto, in a series of short incidents spread over a year in time. Some of the details and much corroboration came from others of the Ihalmuit, particularly Utek and Auliktuk, but in some places I had to supply the continuity of events from what I know of the man and woman concerned and from what I know of their land. This tale, therefore, is not given to you as being completely factual in all its details. Nevertheless, it is a true history of one spring in the present years of the Ihalmuit. This whole paragraph I'm about to read is in italics. Because it is primarily Ohoto's story, I have chosen to let him be the spokesman for all. In the time of my father, we of the people exchanged our spears and our bows for the rifles of white men, and in the early years of my youth the rifles gave us meat when we had need, and though the old ways had changed a little, life in this land was still a pleasant thing. But now, often enough, we do not have any shells for our rifles we own, and that seems strange to me. When the white men first came to the edge of our land and told us of the virtues of guns, we believed them. When they told us to put by the ancient deer hunts of our people and turned to the killing of foxes instead. We did what they wished, and for a time all was well, and we prospered. Like most of the people, I became a fine hunter of foxes from the days of my youth, and I knew all the ways they might be caught. But I did not know much of the hunting of Tuktu as it was done in the days of my father, for I never needed to know while there were shells for my rifle. Now, often enough, there are no shells for the rifles, and I cannot tell why, for I still trap many foxes as the white man wished me to do, yet when I take my catch to the wooden igloo in the south, there is no one to greet me but Hickik the squirrel. It was that way first on a winter many years before you came into the land, and I remember the winter well, for the traders told us they must have many foxes that year. They were so anxious that we gave up the great fall hunt of the deer and used all of our skill and our strength to trap the foxes, believing we could trade them for food at the place of the white man, and so we would have little need of deer meat. But when in midwinter we took our pelts south, the door of the wooden igloo stood open and the white man had gone, leaving only the smell which lingered for many long years. Only dead things lay in his camp. The boxes were empty, and there was no food in the place and no shells for our guns, so we could not even hunt meat for ourselves. Indeed, I remember that winter, though I wish it would go from my memory. Epitna, who was my first wife, died during that time, and my 2 children died with her. Nor was I alone in hunger and sorrow, for in the camps of the people only 1 out of 5 lived to see spring. Some of those who survived tried to return to the old ways of living given us by Tuktu the deer, but it was found that we did not have the old skills we needed. Some hoped and believed the white man would return, and so stubbornly clung to their fox traps. These are gone. Only those remained who tried to return to the deer, and few of these are still alive. Then, 5 winters after the first white man went away, another came in his place. Once again we threw away the pursuit of the deer, for we felt that this time the white man would surely remain. Once more we had shells for our guns, and all things seemed well. Yet last winter the white man again left the land, and again we had nothing to eat but the skins of the foxes we had trapped for trade. Why is it you white men should come for a time, stay for a time, and then suddenly vanish when we are most in need of your help? Why is it? Why can we not take our fox pelts to the trader and have shells for our guns in return? For this is what the trader taught us to do. This mystery I cannot understand. Well, because we did not have shells, we did not have enough meat in the camps during the winter. You have already heard of the winter I speak of, and of the death of the parents of Cooney and Anotelik by the shores of Utek's lake. But you have not heard how it went with those of us who fled toward the east, where we heard rumor of the presence of a new trader. There were 4 hunters living on the shores of Utek's lake, and their families were, as I shall tell you. There was Anglialec, his wife, his old mother, and his children, Pama, Kuini, and Anotelik. There was Utik and Halmek, his wife, and a child in her womb and another in her Amaut. There was Auliktuk, his wife, and his mother, and his children. There was myself, and Nanuk, my wife, and my old father called Iliatutna, and the children Aljut and Iliatutna, who were the sons of my wife by a man who is dead. In the late months of the winter I speak of, Utek and Anglialec took all of the dogs we 4 families still had and traveled south to the camp of Franz to tell him our need, which was great. While they were gone, I went out alone over the snow-covered land to seek out the caches of deer meat that Franz made as bait for his fox traps in the fall. I found only 1 cache, for the snow had hidden the rest, and the one I found had also been found by Kakwick the wolverine, who had left only bones and chewed skin for me. When I came in empty-handed from my trip over the Barrens, I found Utek and Anglialec had returned from the south. They told us Franz had little food to give to the people, for his own caches were empty. Then I knew a very great fear, for the deer could not come again to our land until long weeks had passed. Although we did not have hope, still, while we had dogs to pull our long sleds, we went out to hunt on the sterile slopes of the snow. But when the dogs began to die from their hunger, we could go no more to the plains. That did not matter, for there was nothing to hunt, and had there been, we had no shells for our guns. One night we heard that an old woman, the mother of Anglialak, Angleyalak, Anglialak, had gone from her igloo and had not returned in the morning. It was our duty to mourn. My wife went to the igloo of Anglialak, and when she returned, she told me the wife of that man was sick, nearly to death, with the evil which lies in the lungs. The sickness of death was not far from us all. In our igloo, the boy Ihalmuit sat as still as his grandfather, and neither spoke when I came in or went from the igloo. Young Ihalmuit still had life enough to help me dig under the snow for old bones that might have some strength left upon them. Digging in the snow for old bones that might have rotten marrow in them? Oh my God. Nanook had grown desperate for the lives of her children, and on a day she whispered to me that we must kill the old man, my father, and so have food for the starving bellies of ourselves and the children. I could not bring myself to agree to her plan, for Ihalmuit had been a good hunter all of the days of his life, and he had given freely of his strength and his years to me and my family, and in the days that were gone. But Nanook was desperate as only a woman can be, and so she spoke directly into our ears of the old man who sat on the far part of the high, sleeping ledge, his wrinkled eyes closed. Ihalmuit did not open his eyes as she spoke, and for a long time it seemed he had not heard the urgent voice of my wife. Then at last he slowly nodded his head, and we knew he was willing that we should take what little of life remained in his heart. I would not help, and when Nanook got the rawhide and tried to tie the noose in the end, her fingers shook so that she could not tie the knot. At last she flung the cord from her and threw herself weeping on the ledge between her two children. So Ihalmuit lived a while longer. It was more than 3 weeks since we had eaten meat, and we lived only on scraps of old bones and on the dog and the human excreta found near the camps. At last Utek and Ihalmuit came to my igloo, and Utek told us that in the summer he had heard of a white man who was said to have built a log igloo on the lake many days to the east of our camp. He and Ihalmuit had decided to abandon their igloos and journey east out of the land of the little hills to seek the white man. I agreed to go with them, for it was certain death to remain. But when we asked Anglialak to come with us, he refused, saying his woman was dying, and he would not leave her to die by herself. There were 3 living dogs in our igloos, and these we killed and ate, even to their guts and their skin, and so we had enough strength to start out on our journey. Just lost another one. It was less than 6 minutes. The bright sun brought the first warmth of spring on a day we set out. We walked slowly, and the men, being strongest, carried a few skins to make shelters, and they also carried the children. The women and old ones carried only themselves, and that was enough. When we came to Halo Lake, we found only the families of Halo, Mickey, and Yaha. Hikwa and Katelo had gone with their surviving families, leaving behind in their igloos the bodies of their wives, Epuk and Oquinuk. Hikwa and Katelo had fled out into the plains, hoping to reach a far valley where they believed some deer might have wintered. But no one at Halo Lake ever expected to see any of these people again in his life, though before spring they returned, having found and killed a few deer. In this place we heard news of the camps on Kakumi Lake, and we heard that Kakumi and all of his people were living and had enough meat to eat. Yet we knew there was no use traveling there and asking him for food, for being an evil man he would have turned us away and set devils against us. I've got to pause for a second because that's the first mention of Kakumi, and for good reason. He's the only single individual of the people that later in the book Mowat devotes an entire chapter to, because he's an incredibly powerfully representative character of the worst of what happens when native peoples confront the evils of civilization. He's a corrupted shaman, fallen to greed and narcissism and sociopathy and psychopathy, and I can't help but think that when I get to that chapter, that I, and maybe you too, will see some similarities to him and Donald Trump. Last time I read this was before all that began in 2016, but if when I get there you feel the same way, please leave comments. I'd love to hear. I often think about Kakumi and all that his fall says about so much. We spoke to the 3 families who remained by Halu Akumanik of our plans to go eastward for help, and these people decided to join us, for they too lived with the dead and with the presence of death, and they had but little hope for their lives. It was a good thing for us that they came, for Mickey owned a spit rifle, a .22, whose bullets are as small as a bee and can kill ptarmigan or hares, though they can seldom kill a deer. Mickey also had some of the little bullets, a present from Franz in the early days of the winter. He traveled for 2 days before we were out of sight of the hills of our land. A distance a strong man could have walked in half a day, but we had no strength, and we had to stop every few feet while the women and old people rested their thin bodies on hummocks of snow and tried not to complain of the dull pain in their bellies. On the 4th day we came to the edge of the forest, and here, by good luck, we found the corpse of a deer the wolves had killed and half-eaten. Enough still remained for us, who were more hungry than wolves. We cracked all the bones, and in a tin pot that Yaha had brought, we made a good soup, for now we were in the land where the little trees are, and there was wood to burn. We stayed for 2 days in that place until the deer that Amo the wolf had given to us was gone, to the last shred of sinew which had clung to the skull. Gratitude even for a wolf that's not even present. Certainly no demonizing of the wolf here. Our strength was a little renewed, and we pushed on into the thin forest for another 3 days before we knew that we could not go any further. There was no food where we halted, not even a ptarmigan to be seen, but nevertheless we put up our shelters, for at least we had wood and we could keep warm by the fires. We melted snow and drank great quantities of warm water to still the agony of the teeth that gnawed at our bellies. On the 2nd day at that camp, we had luck once again. Utek had borrowed the spit rifle of Mickey and gone hunting alone, for Mickey did not have the strength to walk in the deep snow of the forest. Utek came suddenly on a hare, and by falling on his knees in the snow, he managed to aim and to kill the hare as it watched him from the edge of the woods. There's a lot of references to surprising good luck, and if you think deeper about the potential spirituality and intimacy that exists, possibly when you really live in connection with the land and the gods of a place, as Daniel Quinn puts it, then luck may really be in some ways the natural world sensing you and understanding you and reaching out to you in your time of need. Now, when he brought the hare into camp, I thought the woman would be frantic to eat it, for the woman had much reason to eat. Utek's wife carried only dry breasts to feed her young child, and she also carried a new child who starved in her womb. My own wife would have snatched at the hare to give life to Ihalmuit and Ihalmuit, and others of the women should have fought for the meat. But this did not happen, for the woman decided that the 3 men whose bodies had suffered the least damage from famine alone should eat of the hare, in order that its flesh would enable these men to travel on to the trader and bring his help back to all the others of our party who could push on no further. So we took the hare into the bush, Utek, Ihalmuit, and I, where the smell of the cooking would not reach the noses of those who had given up their share of the food. Though it was a terrible torture to wait while it cooked, we had to cook the meat, for our bellies would have retched it up had we eaten it raw. I wolfed down my portion, and did not let myself think of the children who lay in the shelter at the camp. Then, with the sharp pangs of food in our stomachs, we 3 set out down the course of a small frozen river to find the place of the trader. It was a 2-day march, though we traveled fast, before we came to the shores of a lake, and across it we saw the walls of a log igloo, which could only belong to a white man. It was a trader. Surely it was a great thing that we had found him in all of the land where there was to search. Luck again. We hurried over the lake, and the white man's dogs heard us and howled as we came near. We knew then that the famine was done with and gone. Already I found myself beginning to forget what had happened in the camps of the people under the little hills. There was no longer any need for the strength which does not come from the muscles, but from the spirit. My legs gave way beneath me, and I fell in the snow. Yet I did not care, for I knew we were safe. The trader, a short little man, came out of his igloo and looked at us as we sat and lay in the snow. We laughed with embarrassment when he saw us, for we were ashamed of our weakness, and we were ashamed that we could not speak his language. We got to our feet and stood there, not sure what we should do. At last Utek pointed to the hollows that lay on our cheeks and showed how his ribs stuck out from his belly. I lay down again in the snow and closed my eyes like a dead man, so that the Kabluna, the white man, would know how it was at the camps. And the trader did not understand. He went to his cabin and brought back a fox pelt, holding it up with one hand and stretching the other hand out to us. Then a great sickness filled me, for we had no fox pelts to trade. Starving men cannot trap fox pelts, and I saw that if pelts were demanded, there could be no help for the people. When we showed him that we had no foxes, the white man suddenly grew very angry, and I thought that perhaps he had not understood why we had came. Again and again we tried to show what our need was, and again we lifted our parkas so he could see the bones of our bodies, but something was wrong, and he did not understand. As I think back on it now, I know the trader could not have understood what we tried so hard to tell him, for no man who has food will turn away one who is hungry. We knew this man had food, for his dogs were fat and well fed, and we would have been glad for some of that dog food if he had only not misunderstood what we said. Perhaps he was afraid of us 3, for Utek still carried the rifle of Mickey, and perhaps this strange white man was afraid. I knew he went back to his cabin, and when he came back to the door he had a deer rifle in his right hand, and in his left hand a sack of flour, but so small a sack that he could have been carried by a child. He flung us the flour and slammed the door shut, and we never saw him again. I had a wild thought that I should take Mickey's rifle and shoot this man so we could take what we needed out of his little log store, but the thought was born only in the memory of the boy Ihalmuit, who was dead now, whether he still breathed or not. The thought flickered and passed, and we 3 turned away and went back to the west of the camps of those whose lives were in our hands. There were no words between us. All words were dead. We ate none of the flour, and so in our weakness it took us 4 days to return, and I crawled the last little way to the fire. Ihalmuit, my father, was finished. He was still sitting by the door of the shelter, but frozen and stiff, with his eyes closed, as they had been at the end of his life. I was afraid Nanook would speak and demand that we eat the flesh of the dead, but she was too weak to speak, and the body of my father sat there where it was. The flour we bought from the white man was enough for a single small meal for each one who lived in the camp. Many could not retain the raw flour, but it did not matter, for it could only hold off the devils of death for a day. In the tent of Ihalmuit, his wife held a dead child to her breasts, and this child was Octilohuk. Ihalmuit could not make her release it, so it too stayed in the tent. So also in the tent of Utek and Ihalmuit, one child lay dead on a scrap of deer hide, the other near death in her womb. Then it was my turn to mourn for the death of a child. Ihalmuit did not wake to my calling, and his small hands were frozen by the frost, which is colder than ice. After him, Aljut, the son of my wife, died and was gone. Death meant nothing to us in that place. There was no weeping, and no woman cried out the laments of the dead. Death meant nothing to us in that place. But those were terrible days, days I did not wish to remember. Let them be forgotten in your ears and in your heart. I will say nothing more of that time. 2 days after our return from the place of the white man, Tuktu came at last, and so the rest of us lived. It was the deer in the end, the deer who alone in all of the world know the needs of the people, who took pity on us in our camp by the edge of the forest when there was no pity in all of our land. Tuktoriak, the spirit who lives in the deer, sent a great buck into our camp and made him stand so close and so foolishly by the fire of Utek that Utek was able to kill the deer, and with the tiny bullets of Mickey's rifle. That was in the spring of the year. Late in the spring, we returned to Utek Kumanik, there to find the wolverine-scattered bones of Anglialik, his wife and his daughter. These bones were buried, as we had buried our dead in the foreign lands of the forest. But for a long time we thought the devils had taken Cooney and Anotilik, and we were very glad in our hearts when we heard that they were safe. So ends Ahoto's memory of the spring of the year 1947, a year that belongs to the present, a year that took 12 lives from the 20 people who were the last survivors of the thousands of men who roamed the plains country only a few decades ago.